Hello, good afternoon and welcome. It's 1 o'clock, so the event is now officially open. Thank you to everyone for joining us today at the Afternoon with Kerry Murphy event, which is kindly sponsored by Hope. I'm Glenn Rothwell, the Membership Services Manager with NDNA, and I'll be your host for today's session. Also representing NDNA today, we have Cara Brundle, Director of Business Development. She'll be introducing our speaker and putting your questions to Kerry after her session. Firstly, some housekeeping and information about how today will work. The event is being recorded. You'll be able to watch it on our website after the event. You'll also be able to see the speaker slides from today's presentations. You'll have a chance to ask questions straight after Kerry's presentation. To ask a question, please use the Q&A function, which you should find at the bottom of your screen, and we will aim to ask this question at the end of the session. You can chat with our sponsor, Hope, and NDNA using the chat function throughout the event. And again, you can find this button at the bottom of your screen. So just to go over those communication channels again, the Q&A function is to ask Kerry any questions, and the chat button is for communicating with NDNA and Hope. Before we move on, I'm just going to do a quick reminder for our members in England with the next slide that comes up. We put together some new resources that we released a few weeks ago, which hopefully a few of you have or many of you actually have downloaded these. So these are childcare funding letter templates to parents and MPs. The parent letter, it explains why nurseries must ask parents to pay charges for funded places and why they're also having to put up fees to parents. And the MP letter, it sets out the urgent issues facing the sector, such as funding and recruitment. So you see there's a QR code on the screen there. If you want to take a picture of that, it'll take you straight to the web page where you can download these letters, which, as I say, many of our members have already downloaded and found them really useful, particularly sending those letters to parents. So that's it from me. I'm now going to hand over to our sponsor and nursery resources partner, Hope, to tell you about your new member discounts. So Danielle, if you're ready, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Glenn. Good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, my name's Danielle and I'm one of the key account managers here at Hope Education. So as the sponsor and preferred supplier of NDNA, I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to tell you all about the amazing benefits as an NDNA member you'll receive when you're shopping through Hope Education. So the first benefit you'll receive is a 15% discount off of every single order you place. As well as the 15% discount, you'll also receive a one-off 20% discount once a year. This discount runs from April to March, and you'll receive this in a way of a discount code via email. Then on not every order you do place, you'll also receive free delivery or free next day delivery on request when placing your order before 2 p.m. There's no minimum order value to receive this benefit. Finally, you'll also have access to an exclusive core list comprising of over 200 essential everyday products with savings of up to 70% off the online price. This list includes everything from arts and crafts to cleaning and everything in between. Okay, so just so I can give you a bit of an idea of some of the savings you can make, I've picked out a few of our best-selling items from the list. Okay, so for a 25-gram bag of sand, we know how much sand gets used up in nursery. The online price is £10.99. Core list price £3.85, so that's a saving of around 65% or £7.14. We also do the bag of sand in a smaller size. So for a 12-gram bag of sand, online price £5.99. Core list price £2.50, saving around 59% or £3.49. Tommy Tippy First Cup, online price £3.29. Core list price £1.99, so that's a saving of 40% or £1.30. And Little Hero Baby White, online price is £1.79. Core list price 80p. That's a saving of 55% or 99p for a bag of 66 white. And there's plenty of other offers to be made from the list. Okay, so how do you claim these amazing benefits, I hear you ask? Right, so whether you're an existing customer, a returning customer, you've never shopped with Hope before, the process is exactly the same and it takes no longer than 30 seconds. All you'll need to do is fill out an NDNA members form online. It literally consists of only 7 questions. So as I said, it will take no time at all, and the link to the form will be shared on the web chat. Then once you've accessed the link and submitted the form, you'll then receive a lovely welcome email from Helen from our onboarding team. And this email will include a PDF showing the exclusive core list, a reminder of the benefits, so the discount and the free delivery, and a password reset link. Once you've opened that link and added a password or re-entered your existing password for those that already have an account with us, you'll then have full access to all of the amazing savings I've mentioned, and you can start shopping straight away. Just so you know, the turnaround from submitting the form to receiving the welcome email takes no longer than 4 hours. Unless the form is submitted after working hours, then that'll be the next working day. So from start to finish, it really is a quick process. I just wanted to mention some of the other functions you can also take advantage of once you're signed up and you're shopping with your Hope Education account. So we've got repeat orders, favourites lists, so you can make as many lists as you like, maybe one for each room or each area of learning. You can track your deliveries, and of course you can also have full access to your invoices and statements. We also offer, I don't know whether you know about this, guys, a free nursery design service, which includes creating a 3D plan of any space, whether it's one room, an outdoor space, or a whole nursery. We will then deliver, assemble and install all the furniture to plan and remove and recycle all the packaging. We also offer this as a platinum service to include resources. Again, I'll share the link with all the information for this in the web chat as it goes into a little bit more detail on the free service. I'll also share our helpline number, just in case there's any queries or questions that you might have after the session. So yeah, that's it for me. I hope this gives you a great overview of everything that you can receive as an NDNA member when shopping through Hope Education. Thank you ever so much for taking the time today. I will stick around at the end to answer any questions you may have. Enjoy the rest of the session. That's it from me. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Danielle. That was a really useful reminder and overview of the benefits that are available from Hope. Well, I'm Cara Brundle, as Glenn said, Director of Business Development at NDNA, and I'm delighted to introduce you to our speaker for the afternoon, Kerry Murphy. Kerry's a childhood specialist with a background in neurodiversity and disability. She's going to provide us with her perspective on neurodiversity based on her experience and research. And she's also going to explain why she's challenging the narrative around developmental difference to improve the quality of play-based interventions for children. Over to you, Kerry. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Perfect, fabulous. Okay, so welcome to this session on neurodiversity affirming practice. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you all a little bit about my journey within this area. And to provide some information about why neurodiversity can be really, really useful in an early childhood context. Before I jump into the content, it's worth saying that this is a relatively jam-packed session. There's so much to know about this area, so I tried to do as much justice as possible, and we will get through the content that we need to today. But you will also get access to the slides at the end of the session, which will have additional slides should you want to find out a little bit more information about neurodiversity. Now, this might be an area that you are already developing your knowledge. You might already be building upon neurodiversity affirming practice. And please do share your own expertise and ideas within the chat. but it's also today about confronting and perhaps interrogating some of the aspects of our practice that are not necessarily benefiting our children and families in the way that we want to. So this is a provocation today. It's really important to state that I absolutely do not have all the answers, and I'm not the fountain of all knowledge in this area. I too am on this journey of really beginning to deconstruct and unpick some of my own practices as well. So when we think about neurodiversity affirming practice, it really is about that community. It's about that collective action. And so it'll be really good to hear, not only through the Q&A today, but through the chat, your own experiences, your own perspectives, your own ideas. And it might also include the bits where you feel a bit uncomfortable, or where there may be feelings that you are not quite sure why this would be relevant to your practice. So do feel free to share all your thoughts. The other disclaimer that I must say is I am delivering from home today, and I have 3 very naughty chihuahuas. My husband is on Chihuahua watch, but if you suddenly hear some barking and I mute momentarily, that is why, but hopefully they will behave themselves across the session. So I'm just going to do a bit of an introduction to who I am, and please do feel free to put in the chat as well who you are, where you're from. If you want to tell me anything about yourself, I'm eager to know. But my name is Kerry Murphy, and I am an early childhood specialist. I've worked in the early years now for about 18 years, and I've worked with different age phases. I've worked with babies, toddlers, and preschoolers. I have also worked within school-based settings. And on my very first day of working with children, the very first child that I ever interacted with was a child who had developmental differences, quite complex differences and needs. And I remember at the time being really terrified and thinking, I don't know how to get this right. But actually, that was a springboard for really being curious about development that looks different, and really being fascinated and passionate about diverse child development. So from my very day one, this is kind of the specialism that I have been developing. And I now look back and think the reason that that child stood out to me, the reason that that child resonated with me, is because I myself am also neurodivergent. So I am autistic and ADHD. This is something that I disclose, I'm quite open about, because I think it is important that we have that representation within the sector, that we recognise that we're not only supporting children with a range of identity markers, but we're also thinking about representation within the workforce as well. I also believe in the importance of drawing upon lived experience, so really using lived experience frameworks to make sure that the provision, the pedagogy, the education, the curriculums that we develop actually account for the differences within human development. I'm also a lecturer at Goldsmiths University in London. So I worked in early years for a long time and then moved into a local authority role. Whilst I was in that local authority role, I was working as an area Senko essentially, and this is where I learned a lot about the importance of embracing developmental differences. And I made that decision to embark on my doctorate, which then led me into higher education. So I teach on the undergrad, postgrad, and PGCE programs. And what's really interesting about that is, as well as working in early childhood, I now get to also explore that transition into primary and what education looks like for children with lifelong differences and disabilities. I'm also an author, writer, and trainer. I do lots of things on top of the day job as part of my professional oxygen, because I spend so much time in primary education. I do a lot of freelance to still get that kind of early childhood input. And as I said, I made that decision to pursue my doctorate, and I am studying at Sheffield University, and I am exploring the pathologization of play in neurodivergent children. So to put it simply, I'm challenging this idea that play does not come naturally to children with developmental differences or disabilities. I'm challenging the idea that those children need to be taught how to play functionally or properly or appropriately or purposefully, and actually instead embracing that all children have an innate desire to play, but play will look different, and it's about our understanding of the different cultures, and play patterns of children rather than trying to rectify or correct who they are in the way that we deliver play-based interventions. So it's quite a controversial topic, but it's been really, really empowering to speak to key people, nursery managers, nursery practitioners, about all the ways in which they embrace and acknowledge the diverse ways of playing. So that's a little bit of an overview to me, so you know why I'm here today. The things that we're going to be covering across this session, and you may already have a knowledge within this area, so please do share, but I'm going to be talking to you about what neurodiversity actually is. It is a bit of a buzzword at the moment. Everybody's talking about it. People kind of have a general idea of what it is. Some people have a more in-depth knowledge. But because we're seeing it out in the wider world, it's become quite a catch-all for thinking about human differences. It's really important to think about how this actually relevant to early childhood, particularly when we're thinking about the different systems and processes that we have in early childhood related to what is often referred to as special educational needs and disability. So some of the things that you will be kind of grappling with today is, where does neurodiversity-affirming practice sit within our traditional SEND systems, and how do we navigate both, because they are quite alternative systems from one another. They are not the same thing. And actually neurodiversity is considered a resistance to our traditional systems, and that's where some of the discomfort can arise. I'm also going to be introducing you to what could be considered a relatively complex concept, but actually when you speak to early years educators and practitioners, they're very aware of this notion that we exist currently in an early education system and a wider education system that favours typically developing minds and non-disabled bodies. So everything within our education system promotes to us that we should all be striving to fit into this idea of, and I'm going to air quote, normal. And so if your entire education system is designed in that way, and it's systemically designed in that way, it can make it very, very difficult to genuinely work towards meaningful inclusion. And so what we're going to kind of unpack today is, what do we mean by ableism? What do we mean by this favouring of typically developing minds and non-disabled bodies? How does it show up in our early childhood spaces, and what could we potentially do about it? So we'll talk about the systemic issue of ableism, but we'll also think about the action of disableism. And disableism is where we uphold this idea that we should all be striving to be normal. One of the things that I will often say when I am doing training is, we need to embrace being weird. We need to acknowledge that humans are weird. We're not normal, and that's actually okay. And a big spoiler, everybody here today is also weird, and weird is something that we need to embrace. We're then going to think about the ways in which we can reimagine child development. So one of the biggest things that I encounter within my everyday work is that we have been primed to believe that all children are traveling down the same developmental pathway, that all children are going to meet milestones roundabout in the same ways. And if they don't meet those milestones, then that is a red flag for a child's development, and we must put something in place to rectify their development. Now, I'm not saying that we don't need that in part, but it doesn't describe the full story of diverse child development. And so a lot of the advocacy work that I do is basically really challenging this idea of typical child development, and again embracing that child development is extremely diverse. There are infinite ways in which you can develop across your lifespan, and we need to stop promoting this idea that any development that isn't on a typical pathway is wrong, or needs to be corrected, or needs to be fixed, or children need to be integrated into being normal. We're challenging those things. So once we've got through all that, as you can see from the agenda alone, there's lots to cover. But hopefully that will leave you in a space where you are able to think about what you're already doing well in terms of your strengths of practice, and thinking about how you might build upon that. But it might also give you an opportunity to think about your next steps in adapting or changing aspects of your practice that are not necessarily neurodiversity affirming. Now, what I'm going to say before we jump into the content it's not my role to say what is and what isn't neurodiversity affirming, because settings themselves are very unique. And you will be within your own context, you will have your own pedagogy, your own beliefs, your own experiences. So it's about you doing what you think is in the best interests of the children within your care and education. And neurodiversity is not about going around and saying this is wrong and that's wrong, although we do unpick things that are potentially not that beneficial. But it's more about building community and compassion in leaning towards more meaningful inclusion. What we have at the moment in our education system, what we are encountering, is a real emphasis on something known as place-based inclusion. So we might have children who are neurodivergent or disabled in our spaces. They may come to our settings, but actually the systems that we are told that we have to use to include these children are very often counterintuitive to actually understanding their diverse development. So in short, a lot of the SEND systems and processes that we have kind of teach us that we need to change that child in order to be able to fit in. And neurodiversity is the opposite of that. It's about embracing the diversity and demanding that we're given the tools, the resources, and the support to be able to deliver that in meaningful ways. So hopefully that appeals. You might want to put in the chat what you're hoping to gain from this session today. It'd be really good to hear from you. So we're going to start by defining neurodiversity, and we've got a little poll just to kind of get a kind of general gist on your current understanding. I know there will be variable kind of knowledge bases in this area. So if we can just, I think it was on this slide, if we can just launch the poll just to kind of check what your current confidence levels are in terms of neurodiversity. And I'm just gonna switch the slide to this one. So what is your current understanding or confidence levels in neurodiversity? It's good just to get a gauge. And I've just realized I might not see that poll, but you hopefully will. And you also have the option, if you don't want to, or if you want to extend from the poll, you might put in the chat. Yeah, if you just bear with us 1 second, I'm just waiting for that poll to be activated. I'm not a poll person, so let's hope that the poll comes up in a second. Ah, fabulous. So the poll question is, do you understand the concept of neurodiversity? And hopefully everybody can see that now. And this just gives me a little bit of a gauge on how I'm going to explain it. So Sophie, you might want to put it into the chat then if you can't. Yes, we've got Leah. Yes, you understand. If you want to expand upon that, I think they've put the poll up again as well. And so it would be great if anybody wants to expand in the chat their understanding of neurodiversity or how you interpret it. Don't worry, so Sarah's just confirmed it should be up there now. And I'm gonna submit mine as well. Fab. So I don't know if we're going to show the results, Sarah, at this point. Ah, okay. Fab. So 74% of you know what neurodiversity is, or you have an understanding. 26% are unsure. So, as I said, please do share your own interpretations. It's really important that we have these various interpretations so that we can really build a good knowledge of the concept. There is a researcher called Dr. Robert Chapman, and one of the comments that they make about neurodiversity is that it is a moving target. And what Dr. Chapman means by that is that actually neurodiversity, whilst it has been around for a long time, this notion of human or understanding human differences as an inevitable fact, we've only really had the language for it in the last couple of decades. And the reason that neurodiversity emerged as a concept is it is a collectively defined term that emerged in the 90s. Now, I don't know if anybody here was around in the days of AOL dial-up, when we used to have to kind of sign into our chats. And back in the 90s, there was groups of autistic people who had, in reality, to put it kind of bluntly, had really got tired and fed up of being considered broken or deficient or deficit. And often we're at the receiving end of non-autistic people making decisions about their lives and who they were, and often experiencing non-autistic people defining what autism actually was. And so in the 90s, you know, people started to go onto the internet because we had the advent of technology, signing into chat rooms, and actually a lot of autistic people started to connect with each other and started to have conversations essentially around the fact that why are other people getting to define who we are? Why are people getting to say that we are disordered, we are broken, we are diseased, we are deficient? And so this notion of neurodiversity was born in acknowledging the fact that actually we're not broken, we're not deficient, we're not disordered, we have a different way of being. And so it collectively was coined by different advocates. And that is why you often see that autism is often the dominant thing that's spoken about in neurodiversity. But what we're going to go on to explore today is actually neurodiversity refers to all of us. And then you think about the different experiences that you have within your brain development and your body development. So neurodiversity is an advocacy coined term. It came out of the fact that those with developmental differences, with lifelong developmental differences and disabilities, just got really tired of having their lives defined by those who actually didn't have that experience. So you will have noticed earlier on when I talked about that concept of lived experience, the only way we can understand people's experiences is about listening to them about what their experience might be. And so that's kind of the origin of neurodiversity. But what Dr. Robert Chapman will often say is that it's a moving target because it is still a relatively emerging concept. We're still understanding or developing our understanding of the human brain. So if you think about what we know now about human development, if we fast forward 100 years, there will be somebody sat in 100 years having a conversation about human difference, and we will know so much more. And so what Chapman reminds us of is this isn't a fixed idea. This isn't a fixed point. It's actually about recognizing that there are infinite ways, various ways in which the human body and mind develops. And we as humans give names to those experiences. So for example, we might refer to somebody as autistic or ADHD or dyslexic or schizophrenic. We create those labels. Now, those labels have historically been created through a medicalized model of disability. They've been created as issues within human development, and neurodiversity counters this and actually recognize that all human development is valid and all human development needs to be afforded the same holistic understanding. So when we use the term neurodiversity, it can often be mistaken for only thinking about those with developmental differences, and that's actually inaccurate. When we use the term neurodiversity, neuro quite literally meaning brain, diversity meaning a range of differences, we are talking about everybody. So everybody in this room today, in this virtual room, is part of or forms part of that neurodiversity knowledge. So we are all different, we are all unique. And this might actually chime with what we often refer to in early childhood as the notion of the unique child. It's that recognition that when we are born, yes, we have our genetics, our physiology, our biology, but actually we're shaped by our experiences as well. And it's an inevitable fact that the way in which we are influenced and shaped by our experiences will impact on our human development and what that actually looks like. So neurodiversity is quite literally the recognition of human differences. Now, you may have heard neurodiversity used in a kind of quite a superficial way. So you often hear people talk about neurodiversity and they might say people who are autistic have superpowers and they're inspirational and we need to celebrate everything about people who are different. And that's lovely, that's really good. But actually, that's not what neurodiversity is about. Neurodiversity is not wholly just looking at strengths and celebrating differences and calling people with developmental differences and people with superpowers. It's a neutral term. So when scholars, when researchers, when neurodiversity advocates use that term, it is meant as a neutralizer. And when we say neutralizer, it's just recognizing humans are different. We're going to have strengths, we're going to have differences, we're going to have interests, we're going to have needs, we're going to have challenges, we're going to have things we're really good at. It's just that recognition of that human difference in a neutral way. And Sunny Jane Wise, who is a multiply neurodivergent advocate, defines it in this way, which I think is a really good definition. Neurodiversity refers to the variability of human minds and all the unique and different ways that people can exist, think, act, process, feel, and function. And recognizing that functioning levels are variable and we all have fluctuating capacity in the world based on a number of different factors. Neurodiversity is a neutral term that refers to all human minds on the planet. So you will see me with my big arms. I'm always like, it's everyone. Neurodiversity is everyone. It includes everyone. And it is a simple and inevitable and an undeniable fact that the human population is diverse in our body minds. So neurodiversity advocates will often talk about this concept known as the body mind. And that is quite simply recognizing that our minds are connected to our bodies connected to our minds. So it's recognizing that intrinsic connection. The way I function within my brain translates to how I function within my body, referred to as body minds. And neurodiversity is considered, like other social and personal identity markers, as things such as ethnicity, your racialized identity, your gender, your sexuality, how you express your kind of gender identity and your physical abilities. So it forms part of our understanding of what makes us unique, what makes us different, and how we are influenced and shaped. Now, neurodiversity as a concept, the reason that becomes useful to early childhood is A, it is quite compatible with what we are encouraged to do in early years, which is to embrace the uniqueness of child development and to do that in a neutral way. So we often will think about what children are interested in. We will use strengths-led and child-led approaches to build upon children's development. So at its core, neurodiversity makes sense. There's also that very common saying that you hear within early childhood about early experiences shape the developing brain or contribute to the architecture of the developing brain. So one of the questions we have to ask ourselves as early years educators is, what is it that we are doing in early childhood for those children whose development does not follow typical pathways to make sure that that shaping of the developing brain actually follows a healthy developmental pathway. And there are discussions and debates at the moment that actually what we are encouraged to do in early childhood doesn't always contribute to healthy development, because a lot of the times we often find ourselves having to put children in interventions or being subjected to strategies, as we will go on to see, that is about changing who they are, which is about rejecting or denying their difference. Now, when I say that, that isn't an individual criticism. That's not saying, oh, you're doing this as an individual. It's recognizing that that's the system of which we all exist, and it's a system that we should all resist against. So neurodiversity, to put it simply, it's human differences. It's all of us, and it's recognizing human differences. Now, what you might also find is that there is a language to neurodiversity. Now, there can be, from some neurodiversity advocates, they can be quite dogmatic or quite fixed on, we've got to get the language right. And I absolutely understand why we need to use accurate language. But I also recognise when you are a busy early years educator and you are spinning 1,000 plates and you are already interacting and engaging with a very complex system that is SEN and disability support, when somebody comes along and says, wow, look at this neurodiversity and it's got all its own language, I know a lot of early educators are often very, very exhausted, very overworked, and kind of feel that little bit of resistance of, we've already got a complex SEN system, how is this going to make a difference? And that is my role today, to convince you that it would make a difference and that it is worth being aware of this language and being aware of why it is actually more helpful in our practice, why it will lead to better solidarity with our parents and families, why it will help with our children to develop a positive self-esteem and self-identity, why that neutral perspective of human difference actually gives our children greater opportunities to progress in ways that are more in line with thriving rather than surviving or fitting in. So these are some of the terms that you will hear associated with neurodiversity, and it's okay to get these wrong at times. I still get them wrong, even though I've been exploring this area for quite a few years now. It's more about understanding why that language might offer us something new. So you will sometimes hear people refer to neurotypicalism. Neurotypicalism, quite essentially, is thinking about those children whose brains conform to typically developing expectations. So when you're in your early childhood setting, it's those children that form basically the neuromajority. It's those children that when you pick up your child development documents, whatever they might be, you can see those children represented. It's those children that meet traditional or typical milestones. It's those children that you kind of generally see them as having a sense of belonging when in your setting. Now, the problem with this, there's no problem with being typically developing, but the issue that we then encounter is that actually our entire early education system is built on favouring this typical or neurotypical conforming pathway. So we live not only in an education system, but a society that favours this. And we'll often frame this as the ideal or normal way of being. And actually across the early years, we have that trajectory where children will go through, say, for example, their development matters. And at the end of the foundation stage, the way we measure that child is we look at a good level of development. When you think about good level of development, what we're actually saying there is typical level of development. Is the child fitting into what we deem normal or typical? And so the question that we're naturally going to ask is, what then happens to those children that don't fit into that ideal? And should children be fitting into that ideal? I'm going to jump along one and refer to the term neurodivergent. So when you hear the term neurodivergent, it quite literally means diverging from that what is considered typical or normal. So neurodivergent refers to those children whose development diverges from typically developing expectations. Some of the common ones that you might see is children with developmental language differences, children who are autistic or who are emerging ADHD or dyslexic or dyspraxic, children with sensory processing differences. So any experience where your development takes a diverse or a divergent pathway, you would be considered neurodivergent. Now, unfortunately, we live in a society that views these differences as something that needs to be fixed or reduced. So again, this isn't about individual criticism. This is about recognizing that everything that you pick up and use, whilst it might on the surface seem quite inclusive, and in some ways it might well be, the general gist of things is, if you are diverging from what is typical, we need to figure out how to get you back on that typical pathway. So if, for example, we look at the term special educational needs, The very definition of the term SEN is about children who are not at age-related or peer-related expectations. So you are identified as SEN because you do not meet the norm, and that is regardless of whether you are on an entirely different developmental pathway. So if you are labelled as SEN, as having special educational needs, the belief then is actually you're labelled as such because we need to put in things to get you back on that normal pathway. And so a lot of what we are then encouraged to use is about eliminating those differences rather than affirming those differences and recognizing actually this is unique to that child's developmental pathway. So neurodivergence is kind of an umbrella term for lots of different types of neurotypes, as you can see on the slide there. So when I use the term neurotype, I'm quite literally referring to the type of neurodivergence you have, such as being dyslexic or autistic. So I have the autistic and ADHD neurotype. Now, you might be thinking, actually, not every child within my setting is diagnosed, so they're not yet diagnosed, or they might be on a diagnostic pathway, or we might not quite know what the difference is. What you tend to find, or what I find when I go into early education settings, is educators are very attuned to knowing, is this just a little bit of a difficulty in a particular area? Is there a little bit of a delay, and with some support that child actually is neurotypical? Or is this an indication that the child potentially has lifelong differences? It's very, very rare for me to go into a setting and for a practitioner not to kind of have a knowledge of that. And it's why we will sometimes speculate about what that neurotype might be, even though we aren't necessarily there to do that speculation. You can kind of have a conversation with an educator and they'll be like, well, they have special interests, they use a lot of echolalia, they're quite monotropic in the way that they think. So educators will talk about those traits of difference and kind of know, actually, I think this child is on a lifelong and diverse developmental pathway. And so what we would refer to in that moment is what we know as emergent neurodivergence. So when I'm working with educators and families, we can have that conversation around, we don't quite know what neurotype they are, but we know they're emerging into their neurodivergence. So we've seen enough traits to know that they're on a different developmental pathway. So what you're hopefully picking up even from now is that actually the way I'm speaking about children who have developmental differences is different to what we're traditionally taught to talk about those children, in the way that we're taught to talk about those children, usually as problems to be fixed or solved. We usually think about the concerns, we usually think about the delays. Now, the other really, really important thing to recognize of neurodiversity is when we're having this conversation, whilst you might notice a shift in the way that I use my own language, neurodiversity is absolutely not the denial of children having very real challenges and difficulties within their developmental experiences or their lived experiences. It is not the denial. It's not about looking at a child and going, let's ignore all the areas in which they're struggling with and let's just celebrate how good they are, because actually that does a disservice to the child. We absolutely step in, we attune to a child when they need support, but it's about understanding their holistic development. So the big thing that you will find neurodiversity advocates will talk about is holistic. We afford the same holistic understanding of a neurodivergent child as we would a child who conforms to neurotypicality, because what we know currently is actually just the knowledge that a child has a traditional special educational need, or is on a diagnostic pathway, or has a diagnosis, or is neurodivergent. Our thinking can immediately shift to, well, what's the problem and how do I fix it? And so we're then missing those golden threads and those vital moments to really understand the child's holistic developmental profile. I can see there that Dawn said in the chat that you use the term additional learning needs. So yes, we do see different areas use different types of language in order to move away from what is now very much considered a stigmatized term. So a lot of people, particularly disabled and neurodivergent people, fully reject the term special educational needs. The only provocation I'm going to provide there, Dawn, is when we think about special and shifting it to additional, yes, the child might in the interim need some additional support to be able to access what they are accessing or their development needs. But what there has been found in some research is actually additional still creates that burden-based mentality. So if somebody has additional needs, their mentality can be, oh, well, that child's going to need more than a typical child. And it can still reinforce that stigma. Now, that's me just sharing it as a provocation. I'm not necessarily taking a position on that. I tend to use the term developmental differences and needs. So again, I neutralize. I don't talk about something being special. I don't talk about something being additional. It's just developmental differences and needs. And that's the kind of neutral term that you can consider. So how do we then bring neurodiversity to life? So this is where educators can often think, okay, well, this is all interesting, this can be exciting. And what I will say today in this session alone, we can't cover all the practical things that we can do, but I'm hopefully going to try to introduce some of those. But neurodiversity is a concept. It is a theoretical concept. So just knowing that children and all humans have human differences is not enough on its own. So what we then need for that concept is we need a framework. So what neurodiversity advocates have created is what is sometimes referred to as the neurodiversity paradigm. When I use the term paradigm, I'm quite literally talking about a framework. It's the kind of principles of what you would then follow, and I'm going to talk about that today. Now, if you've got your framework, you then need people who believe in that framework to carry that forward. So my advocacy, the work that I do, is about speaking to early years educators and thinking about how they can carry that framework forward, which becomes a neurodiversity movement, of which one already exists and is very kind of blossoming within kind of education and wider society. So it's early educators who actually carry this forward, and because it's early educators who are spending every day with children, you are the people who make that difference. So you might have people like me in the background that are providing that kind of framework and facilitation, but where it comes to life is actually having early educators that are invested in recognizing the problems of our current system and processes. And then you deliver that through something known as neurodiversity-affirming practice. Now, neurodiversity-affirming practice is when we start to challenge, or when we start to reshape what we are currently doing, to move away from this idea that children are simply problems to be fixed. And we move towards, actually, if we have children within our early childhood settings that have lifelong differences, how are we then actually helping them to understand their lifelong differences so that they grow up to be individuals who have good self-esteem, who understand their differences and needs, who can self-advocate, who can engage in society in a way that's inclusive. So we're giving them that springboard, and actually we're teaching them to be autistic is not a bad thing. It's not a negative thing. It is part of who you are, and it's a valid part of who you are. Let me teach you about that part of yourself so that you can then integrate into your mind that as part of your identity. So it's a really positive way of thinking. Now, when we think about the term neurodivergence, we are covering lots of different, well, we're covering all neurotypes essentially. So just to kind of, I'm not going to labor too much on this slide, but it is important to recognize that when we think about neurodivergence, it quite literally refers to anything that results in your development diverging from its typical pathway. And that can include, for example, the experience of trauma or adverse childhood experiences. Anything that impacts your brain and body development can be counted as neurodivergence. Now, again, some people will say, well, to have mental illness is not positive. You know, it's a difficult experience. bringing yourself back to the idea that neurodiversity isn't just about being positive, it's about having a neutral perspective of human difference and putting things in place for people so that they can thrive. So mental health differences are included under that neurodivergent umbrella. What I will say is there is debate about that. There are different perspectives and views, but it's about recognizing that even those with mental health differences will still have strengths, they will still have differences and needs. So it's about understanding them under that broader umbrella. And I have written a guide with Anna Freud, a guide to neurodiversity, which kind of breaks down some of what I've already discussed today. So the big question, and I've already kind of alluded to it several times, is why do we actually then need neurodiversity affirming practice in early childhood? What is the issue? And the issue is ableism and disableism. So as I said at the beginning, ableism refers to the favoring of typically developing minds and non-disabled bodies. And ableism is about this idea that it is better to be considered normal or to be considered typical or non-disabled. And if you fall outside of those definitions, then actually you are less than. So you're kind of typically developing people and non-disabled people are kind of, or have it communicated to them that, well, you're superior because you're considered normal. And not necessarily, ableism is about not necessarily being interested in understanding actually if you are disabled or if you are neurodivergent, what is that experience and what is the joy within your life, what is the purpose, what is the things that make your life valuable, because ableism teaches us that those people's lives aren't as valuable or valid as it is to be normal. So it's quite an insidious part of our society, and it is systemic. Now, the definition that I'm going to share with you here, it's a loaded definition. It might kind of set off lots of cans of worms in your thinking. But the thing about ableism is to recognize is it doesn't sit on its own. It's connected to other forms of discrimination. So ableism is the system. And I'm going to say to you all now, we are all suffering from ableism. Whether you are disabled, neurodivergent, or neurotypical, or non-disabled, we all suffer from the impact of ableism. So what does it mean then? So Talila A. Lewis, who is a Black anti-racist abolitionist in the States, has created a working definition to acknowledge how it is linked to other forms of discrimination and to outline what it actually means. The reason she's developed a working definition is because Lewis acknowledges that that definition may change as society progresses. So what is it then? Ableism is the system of assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on socially constructed ideas of normalcy. So what we've got to recognize is we as humans decide what normal is. Therefore, we as humans can decide to reject ideas of normalcy. But ableism is also about assigning value to people's bodies and minds based on how productive they are. So one of the conversations I will often have with educators is about school readiness and how school readiness is an inherently ableist concept, because the question that most educators will often ask about school readiness is, what are we actually getting children school ready for? And in a lot of ways, we're getting them ready for compliance to the school system so that they are considered productive and conformist to that system. It's also linked to our desirability, our perceived levels of intelligence. So again, if we think about the education system in the UK, we are one of the most tested populations in the world. We test children's intelligence. We measure them by a one-size-fits-all standard. We don't necessarily embrace multiple forms of intelligence, excellence, and how fit you are. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in ideas of eugenics, the idea of an ideal race, anti-Blackness, racism, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. Capitalism deeply affects us all because it convinces us that in order to be valuable, in order for us to be considered valued in society, we all need to be constantly busy and productive. So we see that played out in the news constantly. Some of you may have recently seen some of the conversations around disabled people and sick notes, for example. So this idea that if you're disabled and unable to work, then you do not have value, and therefore you are lesser than a typical or non-disabled person, rather than making your society more inclusive so that disabled people are not made ill by it. This systemic oppression leads to people in society determining people's values based on their culture, their age, the languages that they speak, appearance, religion, birth, or living place, how healthy and well they appear, and their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and behave. So ableism at its heart is about narrowing people down into kind of valuable citizens that contribute to the later economy. And what a lot of educators will say to me when they see this definition is, first, my brain is breaking slightly, but educators will often say, well, what's that got to do with early childhood? And the answer is, this training begins in early childhood. And I'm going to give you some examples of that in a moment. So from a child's earliest years, they are subject to this ableist mentality that you must be productive, you must reach a good level of development, you must follow a typical pathway, you must be school ready. So we're constantly looking for signs of compliance. Now, where neurodiversity becomes useful in early childhood is most early educators are already resisting against those systems. Most early educators are already saying, we don't want our children to be focusing on sitting still. We want them to be playing and moving and being free and wild. You know, we embrace that in early childhood, but it is at risk as we face more top-down standardization. You do not need to be disabled to experience ableism. So we're all suffering from it. I always refer to the example that when we ask each other how we are, we will often say, oh, I'm really busy and I'm really tired. Because if we admitted that we were being lazy or we'd been skiving, we would be judged for that. Similarly, most of us probably still turn up to work if we are ill or unwell. We've got to obviously maintain our livelihoods, but part of that as well is this idea of you're weak if you are sick or you have sick days. So we will force ourselves into work regardless of the fact that we likely need to rest. So we're all suffering from this. Now, this is a huge systemic issue. And so the big question that educators will ask is, well, what on earth am I meant to do about this in my everyday practice? You know, how do I make a difference to this? And that comes through disableism or the recognition of disableism. And this is where you acknowledge or where you think about, how am I upholding this wider system? And what can I do to start to deconstruct or break down this system? Now, I had a comment recently where somebody said to me, oh, these ideas are all too progressive for me. You know, I just can't really see how I'm going to make a difference. The reality is some of your resistance to ableism, you're not in your lifetime going to see the results of that. This is legacy work that we're taking part in. We are doing this to create better futures for our future children and future generations. So the resistance that you show now, the challenging of some of the systems that you show now will make a difference, but you just might not be around to see it, which I know can feel a little bit depressing, but you could also see it as a really positive contribution to society. So then what are some of the examples of ableism in terms of what we see in early education? So you will notice there that I've skipped a couple of slides because I really want to be able to share this in terms of how this translates to our early childhood practice. And you yourself might think about, okay, is this something that I currently uphold? And there will be different views and perspectives on this. I've used the concept of red flags and green flags, and the reason that I've done that is because it's really interesting that when I first started out as an early educator, I remember doing a program called Every Child Talker, and you had like this monitoring tool, which was really, really useful to look at children's kind of developmental pathways. And it had what was considered typical, but wherever development diverged or was different, it was a red flag. And I remember having a situation with a parent who said to me, isn't red flag danger, like when you're in the sea and there's a shark? And she was like, why are you describing my child's development as a red flag? It's not danger. They just might need a little bit of support. And I remember really finding that a powerful moment where I was like, oh yeah, we do tend to create panic for parents and families when they're thinking about development that isn't necessarily following a typically developing pathway. So what are our red flags then? Red flags. So at the moment, one of the huge issues that we are facing in early childhood is that we are essentially provided with child development documents that only define and describe typical and non-disabled development, suggesting to us, and if you think about a new early years educator that is newly qualified, what we're communicating to that individual is that there's only one universal pathway that all children will follow, despite the fact that we're then surrounded by 30 toddlers that are all winding off down different pathways. So we pick up these documents, you know, whether it be, and I'm not saying that these documents aren't good, but they do not describe diverse development. But if you pick up your Development Matters or your Birth to 5 or your Birth to 3 or your Mary Sheridan or your Illustrated Guide, the problem is that when you pick that up and you're looking to see a neurodivergent or disabled child represented, they're not represented. So if they're not represented in the documents that you're using every day, what that then leads to is this process known as othering. So we start to categorize those children that fit in and belong, and those children that don't fit in, they're on the outside of what we have within our setting. So it creates this othering of those children as though actually special needs children don't actually fit in. And that's where that place-based inclusion happens. They're here, but we're not actually necessarily including them because we don't have the development to describe them. When their development doesn't fit in, we might then also see quite clinical terms to describe them. So, you know, I've seen a couple recently, alarm bells. I saw alarm bells in one of the documents that I picked up. We have observation checkpoints. We have the red flags, and it's kind of like, oh, it's separate to actual diverse development. We might see children's developmental profiles be described as delays or symptoms rather than traits. So there's kind of a red flag of that kind of ableist mentality. And you imagine if you're a parent and all you're being exposed to is where your child's development is going wrong, even though actually that child's development might not be going wrong, they might just be on a different developmental pathway of which you as an educator have not been given the information to be able to actually support that pathway. I think as educators, we should be angry about that and we should be upset. The other issue is, and that I have found, is that we tend to have these systems where we'll get our guidance on child development for all the normal children. And then what we'll find thereafter is that a guidance document will come afterwards. Now, it's great that those guidance documents for children who are traditionally identified as SEN are being produced, but it creates this afterthought mentality of like, oh, here's my main children, here's my normal children, and here's my special needs children. So when it comes 3 months after, is it any wonder that we then see those children as separate to our entire environment? So you can see where I'm talking about this systemic issue. I had it myself where I would think about children who were in the kind of mainstream bit and those children that were often then segregated. So it's about shifting our mentality. So it's about recognizing that actually children who don't fit into these documents, it's the documents that are wrong, not the children. And so we need to think about the different traits and differences to expand upon our ideas of diverse child development. So, for example, we've always been taught that children who use echolalia, which is the repetition of phrases and sounds, both in the immediate and delayed way, so they might use it immediately after they've heard it or over time. We've always been taught, oh, that's actually a problem within development and we need to ignore echolalia. But what we now know is that actually some children are on a different developmental pathway where echolalia is their main form of communication and is part of a different language acquisition pathway, of which they will likely reach the same point as their neurotypical peers. But we've always been told echolalia is bad. So you imagine if you picked up a child development document that actually described what the true meaning of echolalia is. When you're in practice, you're then able to really make a difference to those children. We then have ableist outcomes. So I'm going to skip one because I've already touched upon the red flags. But we have quite a lot of ableist outcomes within our kind of child development documents. So, for example, at the end of the foundation stage, there is an emphasis placed on speech over other forms of communication, despite the fact that you might have children within your setting that are deaf, have glue, have hearing loss, who are non-speaking, who are minimally speaking, who are Gestalt language processors, and who have situational mutism, and who may use alternative and augmentative technology to communicate, or sign, or visuals. So you imagine you're told as an educator, speech is the main form of communication that you should be promoting. We should be focusing purely on language. What then happens is at the end of the foundation stage, we then decide whether a child has reached a good level of development based on how much language or speech that they're using. And so if, for example, you then had a deaf child, they would not reach a good level of development, even though they are perhaps demonstrating their communication skills in a different way. So you can see the ableism that we're favoring speech and we're not recognizing that actually children have different communication identities and communicate in multiple ways. So again, if we had descriptions for that, if we had understandings of that, that would make a huge difference to children. The next one is that there can be an emphasis for us as early educators to teach children to mask their inherent traits of neurodivergence through corrective early intervention. So as a neurodiversity advocate, I do not prescribe to the idea of early intervention. I absolutely believe that we should attune and support children from their earliest point, but I do not believe that that happens through intervention. I believe it happens through attunement and providing what is developmentally meaningful for that child, because historically, early intervention is about how do I correct or fix the child. So, for example, you might have intervention programs that train the child to sit still or train the child to provide eye contact, even though they don't provide eye contact, they have sporadic eye contact. What happens when we have interventions that are not compatible with neurodiversity is the child starts to develop an understanding that I'm not welcome, I'm not accepted, I'm denied for who I am, and they start to engage in something known as masking. And masking is the process by which you start to conceal who you are. So, for example, as I've shared, I'm autistic, and I was always told that I was rude for not providing eye contact. I now will provide eye contact, even though it is physically painful for me to do so. It's uncomfortable, and actually providing eye contact makes it really difficult for me to process what is being said. I will often drop my eye contact like lots of other autistic people because I'm trying to process the spoken language. But I was told, you're being rude, you're being ill-mannered, you need to provide eye contact. So we see this emphasis on corrective early intervention rather than thinking about helping children to understand why they're different. So, for example, if you've got an ADHD child who likes to move, to think, and likes to fidget and move around, it's helping them to understand, oh, this is why you like to move around, because your nervous system is different. And the way you focus and pay attention is by moving. So let's have some fidgets, or let's do some movement breaks, rather than saying you need to sit still because that's what's expected of all children. And teaching all children that actually the way we engage is different. The next one is targeting children's play for early intervention. So I talked about this at the beginning, that this is part of my doctorate. So I absolutely am a massive fan of play, and I'm a massive fan of ensuring that neurodivergent and disabled children get plenty of opportunities for play. But what we're seeing increasingly is this notion of play-based interventions where children are having their play interfered with, or having their play corrected, or having their play judged because it doesn't fit into, again, typical notions of normal. We're also seeing children's play being defined as a symptom of their neurodivergence as opposed to just part of their developmental profile. So to give you an example, I went into a setting and I was observing a group of children, and there was a typically developing child who was engaging in lining things up. So they were creating patterns and lining things up. Now, because they were typically developing, the key person said, wow, look at this. And the child is really engaging in lining things up, and they're creating all these intricate patterns, and it's really fascinating. And it must be part of their schematic development, and I'm going to plan more opportunities for them to line things up. So this was a typically developing child. I then had a similar conversation with another key person who had an autistic child who also liked to line things up. And so the key person turned to me and said, oh, all he does is line things up, so we're going to need to stop that and sabotage his play. And we need to redirect that because it's not healthy to just line things up all the time. So just from knowing that the child was autistic, suddenly the key person had gone from viewing the lining up as part of that learning and development to it's a symptom of being autistic. And what we now know about lining up in autistic play is it's self-regulating, it's part of pattern seeking, it is part of the construction of knowledge, it's about creation of mental rules. When autistic children line things up, it holds lots of meaning. We just need to figure out what that unique meaning is to that child. So when we have this idea that when you are neurodivergent, the way you play is probably deficient or deficit, what then happens is we then overlook the learning that is possibly going on, and we just think about, and a very common strategy is sabotage. So how do we sabotage that child's play so they play more normally? And then we've already covered this, but this idea of labeling children as special educational needs or having additional needs, which creates this burden-based mentality. Again, we're not denying that we need to be able to identify when children have needs, because we need to attune to those needs. But actually, the reality is we all have needs, we all have fluctuating capacity. So the language I tend to use is human needs, developmental differences, or support needs. So I still recognize that those needs are there. But what you tend to find, and particularly in the research, is that special needs has become an ineffective euphemism. It's become a slur in a lot of ways. It's not a term that's actually helping our children because it's got so many negative associations. So that's the kind of highlight, and I'm aware that we're coming to the end, and I want to kind of just move on now to, okay, what's one of the ways in which we can move forward? Obviously, we could be here. Each one of those examples of a red flag is a training course within itself. But what I want to do is to just give you a couple of ideas of how you can reimagine and for your children a neurodiversity affirming practice, which often requires us to reimagine child's development. So the first thing to say is we reject this idea that all children are traveling down the same universal developmental pathway, and we recognize that actually children are unique. They will have their own developmental profiles, and we instead embrace this idea of the divergent pathways of development. We recognize that just because it isn't in our child development documents, it doesn't mean that it isn't valuable. And divergent pathways of development is about recognizing that all children are on unique developmental pathways that may or may not align with their peers, but will likely diverge as the child's individual identity becomes understood and their lived experiences begin to shape their developing brain and body. One of the best things that you can do if you want to explore diverse development is get training from neurodivergent-led organizations. So there are now so many organizations that are doing training in autistic child development, for example, emerging ADHD. So you're getting information from people who actually understand that neurotype and not doing that kind of outside looking in and judging it as a problem to be fixed. We want all children to have healthy development, but we also need to be mindful that development that diverges from what is currently considered normal or typical isn't necessarily wrong or, deficit or an issue. So we move towards what is often referred to as the more than one way mentality. So at the moment, we have a child development kind of system that really focuses on or favors particular ways of demonstrating your development. For example, earlier on, I talked about communication. We favor speech. So what you need to then move towards is this more than one way mentality, that when you're observing, when you're thinking about your children's development, you're actually asking, well, okay, this is the way typically developing children do it, but what are the more than one ways other children might do it? And what you can see here is the green highlights what we favour, and the red is what is often overlooked or looked down upon, despite the fact that it is part of diverse development. And you might see some things on this slide that you think, oh, I didn't know about stimming, or I'm not sure what monotropism is, or I'm not sure of augmentative communication. The reason we're not aware of these things is because we're not taught about them. So the sooner we have access to diverse child development knowledge, what it then means is that when you pick up your child development documents, when you are planning for and thinking about what you want to provide for your children, you actually have the information. So this is the big thing. We need access to information about diverse child development. The other thing that we need to think about is this holistic profile. So at the very start of this session, I talked about we need to afford all children the holistic understanding. And to just end on a bit of an anecdote, when I worked as a area Senko, I would often go out to settings, and I would often be going in to support children who had developmental differences and difficulties. And if I was completing a referral for that child, I would often say to the key person, describe the child on their worst day. Think about the child's worst day so we can make sure that the referral gets accepted, because otherwise we won't get it accepted. And I remember sitting with a parent one day, and the parent turned to me and said, my child is 4 years of age. We knew very early on that he had developmental differences. And in the 4 years on this planet, nobody has asked me about a good day. Nobody asks me what makes a good day for your child. And the conversation that we then went on to have is that at the moment, everything associated with children with developmental differences is about highlighting, emphasizing, or picking out the problems with that child. And that is how we get support. That to me communicates a broken system. If the very system that is meant to support children only relies on what is wrong with children, it's not a system that is working. We need to think about children on their good days. We still get the same information we need, but we think about how we're building our children and families up. And it is the same with this holistic profile. I would often go into settings and I would immediately say, when it was a child with SEN, what's the problem? You know, what is it that I'm here to support with? And I would never spend time thinking about, well, what are they interested in? What are their strengths? What are they good at? What's meaningful to them? Because even knowing that a child has special educational needs or disabilities or is neurodivergent, we shift our perspective, or we're trained to shift our perspective. So a commitment that I made, and this is not about it being a piece of paperwork, this is about your mindset shift, is that you think about the language that you are using to describe children, to talk about children. You think about what attention you give to that child's different developmental and lived experiences. And so my commitment is always to think about that holistic profile. What is the child interested in? What are they motivated by? Where would I find them when I come into your setting? What are their strengths? And when we think about strengths, what is unique to them? Not as a strength of compliance. What is unique to them? What makes them who they are? And how do we acknowledge that? We then think about traits as opposed to symptoms. That's not to say that there might not be symptoms, because there might well be, but in an early childhood context, we can think, what are the traits of this child's developmental profile? So are they a Gestalt language processor? Do they have hyperfocus? Do they have special interests? So what is their traits? You then think about that more than one mentality. So rather than what is the delay, what is the difference? How do they do things differently? Because if you've got a child that is going to go on to have a diagnosis or a lifelong difference, if they spend the earliest part of their lives being told that there is a delay or there is a difficulty, they're never going to develop positive self-identity about that difference. Remember that neurodivergent children, disabled children grow into neurodivergent and disabled adults. So what are we gifting them in terms of the knowledge that they then have about themselves? And then finally, we absolutely have to acknowledge the needs. It's not the denial of developmental needs. This is where I do find the code of practice useful, is the 4 broad areas of needs. So thinking about their communication and interaction identity, their personal, social and mental health differences and needs, their thinking and learning, so their cognition and learning needs, and their physical and or sensory differences and needs. So when you create that holistic profile, you give the child a better chance to make progress because you're taking everything into account. And this is, when I think about that resistance, I don't think that we have an issue with this in early childhood settings. The system is the problem. So it's about how we resist by actually committing to neurodiversity and holistic development. So I'm aware that I'm completely running out of time and I've had to skip a few slides, but hopefully the context is still being picked up. If you're interested in anything that I've spoken about today, I've written a number of tools and guides. So the Anna Freud Guide to Neurodiversity, I've written a beginner's guide to self-directed play in neurodivergence. I've written for the Royal Foundation on embracing divergent pathways of development, and I have recently written an article with David Kahn, who runs Free to Learn Childminding, on Gestalt language processing and echolalia. And just, have I got 1 more minute to just do this last one?
Yeah, you have.
Just to kind of say, I'm aware that I have thrown a lot of things at you, and I'm aware that when we talk about neurodiversity and there's a conversation about ableism, that there is a focus sometimes on what feels like there's the negative or the problems. So I think, first of all, to recognise that early education at the moment is operating within such narrow like a narrow experience in terms of the resource and then the funding and the supports and the professional development that we get, but actually the creativity, the innovation, the neurodiversity affirming practice is happening in our early education settings. I believe that it's from early education that we see this difference actually happening. So you are already probably doing so much. And this quote always kind of resonates with me as something very powerful. And it's to remember that disability and neurodivergence, our disabled and neurodivergent children, are teachers to us. It disrupts our conventional views of what is considered normal or the right way to be. When we reimagine human difference as the disruption of our teaching, only then can our beliefs and practices become the rich and fertile grounds from which we can cultivate the desire to understand difference rather than try to eliminate it. We're not here to eliminate human differences. We need human differences for our survival, and it is through our early education offer that we can really help children to understand who they are and what they can become. So thank you so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Kerry. You've given us loads to think about there, I think, based on thinking about each unique child and their lived experience and their needs. We do have 5 minutes for questions. We have just one question in the chat. I think if anybody else has a question they're sort of burning to ask Kerry, you do have time to pop that in the little Q&A box at the bottom. In the meantime, there was just one question about language, really, and I know comments in the chat have covered sort of different people's understanding about what neurodiversity is. And I know it's interesting that 74% of people said they felt they did understand it, but then chat kind of including slightly different perspectives on what that might mean to them, which brings me to the language. And so we did have a question that's about language and the importance of language, because I think that's one area where people sometimes struggle, don't they, knowing what to say, you know, whether what they say is right. And I know you've touched on that a little bit, that it's almost sort of understanding different people's lived experience is more important than always using the right words. But we had a question about whether a person, would you describe somebody as being autistic or somebody who has autism, and is that the main thing, or is it more about sort of understanding how to kind of listen to them and respond to them as unique individuals rather than focusing on the language?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So I think that we should focus on language. I think language is important because language turns into action, essentially. And the question around what language should we use in relation to different neurotypes. So there's a lot of research in the area of whether we use what is referred to as identity first language, for example, an autistic person, as opposed to person first language, which is a person with autism. So I can speak from the autistic research. There is a general preference from the autistic community, so a majority preference for identity first language. So for example, I would prefer to be called an autistic person rather than a person with autism, because I do not carry my autism around. It is part of who I am. And saying autistic person is in itself a form of resistance. It's a refusal to feel shame about being autistic. It's recognizing autism isn't all of me, but it forms part of who I am and the way that I perceive the world. And many other autistic people also take that view. However, we have to be pragmatic and realistic. Not everybody prescribes to the same language. So if I meet another autistic person, I will always say, what are your language preferences? And they might say, I prefer to be called a person with autism. Great, I'm an autistic person, you're a person with autism. So the point here is ask, and I know it can sometimes feel uncomfortable, but to ask is really, really important, because the person will very much appreciate that you have informed them or you've given them that chance to state their preference. And similarly with parents, when I am working with parents, I will say to parents, if they're getting their child diagnosed, do you have a preference on how I refer to your child? Would you prefer identity or person first? Some parents will have a very clear take on it. Other parents will go, well, what does that mean? I don't know about that. And that gives me a moment to tell them, okay, so identity first means this, person first means this is related to this kind of advocacy. And then the parent can make that decision on behalf of their child until the child can make their own decision. So asking questions is important about language. The other thing with
fantastic.
language,
Can I just, we have got another question in the chat. Can I move on to that? It would be great to be able to fit that in. If you 30 seconds quickly to finish what you were saying. I don't mean to interrupt, but I did want to get to the next question.
okay, yeah.
From Kim, how would you tackle conversations around trying to mould the child into expected developmental pathways with regards to the professionals that our early years professionals are working with? I think that's a really important one, isn't it? Because it's all very well to, to recognise all this ourselves, but when we're dealing with other professionals, local Senko teams and inclusion teams, etc., how do they have those conversations successfully?
So it's one of those questions that I'm not going to be able to answer in 30 seconds. It's a question or it's a discussion I'm constantly having at the moment about how do we appropriately navigate that. Some very quick things, because this is again a training in itself, is developing. So I've developed something called advocacy scripts, and it is basically sentence starters to share with your professionals so that you can appropriately challenge some of their deficit perspectives and takes on child development. So having some advocacy scripts, so how you might ask about, for example, a particular goal that's being set for a child, the way they are perhaps writing or talking about the child. But the other big thing is, if you are going to go onto the neurodiversity journey or neurodiversity-affirming practice, you need a policy in place, because your policy then becomes your tool to communicate. We're a setting who are developing neurodiversity-affirming practices, and these are some of the principles that we use to inform that. And we've just noticed that there's a bit of a mismatch in those principles. Can we have a chat about that? I have developed a template for that I'm more than happy to share at the end of this session. But we have to be able to have these conversations. The other thing to recognize is we often see ourselves as here and the specialist is up here. That is not what the dynamic is. You are equals. So your expertise, your perspective is as valuable as the specialist, if not more, because you're spending more time with the child.
Fantastic. Those advocacy scripts, so we've got one request. Are you able to share those? I know you did mention that you can sometimes share some of these documents after the session. We've got a bit of interest in those.
They're incorporated into another training session, so I'll need to get them out and send them afterwards.
Okay, fantastic. One more very quick question, just because I can't let it pass, really. Could we maybe have just a very quick sort of half a minute of advice about how to approach parents who might be totally against their child, the idea that their child is presenting with a neurodivergent set of needs?
So I think that it's unique to each family. You've got to trust the family's journey, and so it's about shifting your language. So shifting your language about the way you speak about that child's possible neurodivergence helps the parent to start to widen their perspective on what this means. You can also share some neurodiversity affirming videos and information. So it's about getting the parent to understand that a form of neurodivergence isn't a curse or a tragedy, and it's helping them to understand actually this isn't because your child's a problem, but everything you might see might describe it as such. And so it's about sharing information that offers alternative perspectives so that you can then have a conversation with parents about their child's potential traits. But again, coming back to that, if we're calling their child's development as red flags or alarm bells, or saying there's problems or concerns, talking about them on their worst day, it's no wonder a parent would be resistant. So it's about introducing neurodiversity so the parent's mindset can be reframed as well.
Thank you, Kerry. And I think you've given us loads to think about in relation to that positive language and sort of shifting that thinking on its head today. So I'm sure that will be really helpful for people in their conversations with parents. Scotland. And Scotland aware of how difficult it is to access. I think we'll have to end it there, I think. Thank you so much, Kerry. You've given everybody loads to think about today. If I could just keep people just a couple of minutes longer, hopefully we will see people at NDNA's conference, which is on Friday the 7th of June at Coventry Building Society Arena. Tickets are only £25 for members this year. That's because it's NDNA's 25th anniversary of becoming a charity. We've got some fantastic speakers across both our leadership and practice streams. So we're looking forward to seeing lots of you there. We hope you'll be able to join us. Also, we are hosting a consultation event next Thursday, which is the 16th of May from 4:30 till 5:30. We'll be gathering views from members about the new experience-based route. There's a consultation out there and we're really keen to hear from you about your responses to some of the detail that's proposed in there. And finally, we would really like to hear from you about how you found today's afternoon with event and Kerry and some of the things that she's talked about. So we have a very quick poll for you. First question being, do you agree that this event has made you more informed about different approaches for neurodiverse children? That's a yes or no. I appreciate that people need to leave, but it is really good to get your feedback so that we can make sure we run really successful events in the future. So we've got 98% yes on that, so that's fantastic to hear. Second question, do you agree that the information you have heard today will help you to reflect on your practice regarding neurodiverse children? Do you agree that the information you've heard today will help you to reflect on your practice regarding neurodiverse children? I don't know if people can see that question. Perhaps not. That one won't launch. I'm going to move on to the third question and hopefully that one will launch. Oh yeah, I have. Do you agree that the information you've heard today will help you to reflect on your practice regarding neurodiverse children? So that's up now. A little bit slow, so bear with us. We have, yeah, we've got again, same 98%. So that's really good to hear. And lastly, has the event made you feel more informed about the latest developments in the sector? Has this event made you more informed about the latest developments in the sector? So that's great. 90% of you said yes, that's the case. The keeping you informed is one of the key pillars of our member value proposition. So that's really good to hear. Any other thoughts that you have, please pop them in the chat box. We'll have a good read through those. Sorry not to be able to cover them all, but it's now 2:32. Thank you again for joining, and thanks very much to Hope for sponsoring this event and to Kerry for delivering a really thought-provoking session for us. Thanks very much, and we'll see you all soon. Bye.